Thank you for the great introduction, and thank you for being here. What I want to talk to you about today is about rebel talent, about how companies and their leaders succeed by allowing their employees to break rules, be themselves, and bust out of the status quo. As it turns out, this is the best fix to the employment engagement problems that most organizations struggle with. Now, I want to get started to ask you if you can think about ways in which at work or even in your social life, you behave a little bit like this sheep. Now, whether we like it or not, no matter how competent or smart we are, we all tend to conform to peer pressure, to follow the herd. Have a look at this video over here. What you see is this person being joined in the elevator by a few other paid actors who seem to have a very different understanding of the appropriate behavior of standing in an elevator. And it doesn't take too long for this person to feel the pressure and conform. Now, as it turns out, the fact that we all tend to conform to peer pressure is something that psychologists have been studying and known for decades. In fact, if you go back to the 50s, psychologist Asha Solomon demonstrated that the peer pressure to conform is so powerful that it occurs even in situations when we know for a fact that it's going to lead to bad decisions. And that's not the whole story. We also conform to the status quo. Most traditions and practices in organizations, in fact, endure out of routine rather than being the result of careful choice. I got interested in the study of conformity when I experienced the pressure to conform myself. This was back in 2001 when I landed in Boston from Italy, where I grew up and where I was born. And soon after arriving, I started taking all sorts of speech classes because I was bothered by the fact that my funny accent made me stand out. Now, I know what you're all thinking, what a huge waste of money, and I agree. But I also decided to overhaul my wardrobe and started buying American fashion rather than wearing my favorite Italian brands. Soon after, though, that didn't feeling right. I had all sorts of negative emotions. And so I decided to have and use a different strategy and just be who I am. Conformity, in fact, made me feel inauthentic. Now, a few years later, with my colleagues Miriam Kuchaki of Kellogg University and Adam Galinsky, who's at Columbia, I decided to study the experience of inauthenticity. We had hundreds of people like us writing about situations in which, in their personal and professional life, they felt either authentic or inauthentic. And these are the type of descriptions that we received. This is one about inauthenticity. This was a business meeting where I had to support something I didn't necessarily believe in. I didn't have to lie or deceive anybody. I just had to go along with the group on an issue I wasn't terribly in favor of. I felt a little embarrassed and ashamed afterwards for not standing up more. I think this is a very common experience. So in our study, we had participants provide these essays, or we put them in situations where they felt either inauthentic or authentic. And then we asked them to give us their reactions and give us their preferences for a series of different behaviors. And what we find, study after study, is that the experience of inauthenticity leads to the same type of reactions that we have when we behave dishonestly. In fact, experiencing inauthenticity makes people feel immoral, impure, even dirty, to the point that they feel a greater desire for behaviors like getting into the shower, but also it leads them to engage in behaviors that tend to compensate for these feelings, like being more generous towards others or donate money to a good cause. Now, authenticity then seems to be quite a powerful experience, one that can help us feel good feelings rather than bad ones. But it also can lead us to be more persistent in the face of challenges. Meet Massimo Bottura. Bottura is a 55-year-old Italian chef whose restaurant, Osteria Francescana, this year won the award for being the best restaurant in the world. The restaurant also holds a 3 Michelin star. It was opened in 1995, and at first, it met a lot of resistance from tradition-bound Italians who were basically appalled by the type of food that Bottura was putting on his plates. And the lack of support from the local made it really difficult for Bottura to keep his restaurant open for the years after. But something changed in 1999, where he got the chance to spend the summer at Il Bulli, at the time a 3 Michelin star restaurant, known to be the best restaurant in the world. And what he recounts about that experience is that he learned something very important from the chef and owner of Il Bulli. That if you need and if you want to succeed in your business and in your career, you need to fight conformity and you need to be who you are. In his own world, what he learned is the freedom to feel my own fire, to look inside myself and make my thoughts edible. Now, what this story suggests is that if we want to succeed in our business, if we want to be creative, experience high level of performance, we need to be who we are. We need to be able to express our own fire. But one question that I had when I met Bottura was, is this more of a general phenomenon? So my colleagues and I wanted to find out. We again invited groups of participants into our lab, and in this case, we invited participants who identified themselves to be Red Sox fans. And what we asked them to do is wear wristbands, engage in a series of tasks, and then tell us what they thought about the product that they were wearing. So half of them were asked to wear Red Sox wristbands, yay! And half of them were asked to wear New York Yankees wristbands. They engaged in a series of tasks. The task that we were interested in is asking them to put their dominant hand into a bucket of ice. And we were interested in seeing how long they could keep their hand in the bucket of ice. Now, our theory and our predictions were that people who were wearing the Red Sox wristband would feel authentic, and they would be able to persist against the pain for longer as compared to the people wearing the New York Yankees wristband, since we thought that would make them feel inauthentic. And this is exactly what we see in our data. So in a sense, experiencing authenticity helps people persist longer when experiencing physical pain. But as it turns out, the benefits of authenticity even go beyond physical pain, and they apply also to social pain. In follow-up studies, we again asked participants to engage in tasks that make them feel authentic or inauthentic, or we asked them to provide essays in which they thought about and wrote about situations where they were inauthentic or authentic. And then we asked them to play a game, a virtual game with other participants. Here's how the game works. You start out by tossing the ball around, and you are the player at the bottom of the screen. But all of a sudden, the game is a little bit different, and now you see player one tossing the ball, and what the heck? You're left out. And as it turns out, this is a good game to make us feel excluded. It raises our levels of stress and anxiety about the fact that people are leaving us out. What is interesting is that, again, study after study, what we see is that both in terms of psychological stress, so feeling anxious and stressed out that you've been left out, but also in terms of physiological stress, the levels are higher for the people who, prior to doing this game, felt inauthentic rather than authentic. So again, what this research suggests is that authenticity can be quite powerful. But it's not only about feelings, it's also about levels of performance. Feeling authentic leads us to perform better. We saw this in some of our studies, one of which was a study in which we looked at 166 entrepreneurs in a pitch competition held at a private university in the United States. What the entrepreneurs were doing is pitching their venture ideas to a group of judges who were evaluating the ideas independently and then got together at the end and decided who the winners of the competition would be. And we asked the entrepreneurs after their pitches to fill out a quick questionnaires in which they had to report the extent to which they felt authentic and genuine during their pitches. And what we find is that authenticity leads to 3.16 times higher odds of being the winner in the competition. So what this research seems to suggest is that authenticity, as compared to the inauthenticity, leads us to feel more positive feelings. It helps us navigate through difficult challenges, and it also leads us to perform better in what we do. But given that there is so much pressure to conform at work, how is it that we make sure that every time, every morning we get to work, we sort of don't check a good chunk of our real selves at the door? I think that there are some very simple ways to do this. Let me find the answer by going back to my Italian roots. Italian sculptor and artist Michelangelo Buonarroti said something really important about the sculpting process. He describes it as a process whereby the artist releases an ideal figure from the block of stone in which he slumbers. All of us have those ideal forms inside of us. We have, in Bottura's words, our own fire. We just need to figure out how to get it out. And I think that the main task of leaders and organizations is to help us do just that. So how do we do it? I'm going to ask you to do a quick exercise to demonstrate the answer to this question. So if you're sitting down here, stay with me. If you're sitting up there, I'm going to ask you for a few seconds to just close your eyes. If you're sitting down here, I'm going to ask you to read whatever you see on the screen out loud as quickly as you can. Ready? Okay, open your eyes. I'm going to ask you to do the same things. You can watch. Are you ready? I know. Now, some of you saw letters prior to coming up to this ambiguous piece of information. Some of you saw numbers. And just that gave you different lenses that you use to interpret this piece of information. Every organization, every leader can do just that. All of us can think about ways in which we can shape our task and work in order for us to be able to express ourselves. Let me give you an example of how organizations can do this. Meet Mellody Hobson. Mellody is the president of Ariel Investment, a Chicago-based money management firm. She's very successful in her work, and Ariel was her first job after graduation. And she described getting to work on her first day and getting a very important piece of advice from her mentor, the CEO of the firm, basically giving her license to be who she is, to speaking her truth. There are other ways in which organizations can do this right from the start. I'm going to tell you about a project that my colleagues Dan Cable of London Business School, Brad Statz of the University of North Carolina, and I engaged in. We traveled to India, and we studied a firm, an IT firm called Wipro, and we did an intervention in their onboarding process. So some of the people joining the firm went through a slightly revised onboarding process where we basically asked people to take the time to think about who they are, what's their uniqueness, and how they could sculpt the job such that they could express themselves. And the rest of the people went through the usual onboarding process. And what we saw was stunning in my mind. We saw that people were more engaged in their jobs months after, they performed better, and they were also more likely to stay with the organizations 7 months after this simple intervention. In fact, if you look at their turnover rates, they were significantly lower in the situations in which the onboarding process was slightly different. So let me ask you the big questions. In what way are you going to be rebel talent going forward? And maybe even more importantly, how is it that you're going to help others do the same? I hope I gave you some insights to find the answer to these questions. The main reason and objective of talking about deviance at work is not to give you license to engage in behaviors that maybe benefit you but are hurtful to the workplace. Rather, what I hope we can all do a little bit differently going forward is engage in deviance at work that is beneficial to you but also to the organization. Taking that mask off, allowing our individualities to come out more often at work and in our social life without the worry of looking or sounding different. Thank you.